All right. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us for this year's Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar. I'm Bethany Farmer, ARC Network's Community Librarian. Today we are hosting a member of the 6th cohort of the Virtual Visiting Scholars program. This program empowers scholars to complete metasyntheses and meta-analyses of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity in STEM. Before we introduce today's guest, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items and a brief overview of the ARC network. First, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC network website. Live captioning is available through Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a number of different menu options. To the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. For the beginning of our webinar, you will only be able to view the messages from the ARC team. We will also use the chat to share links to the resources and our feedback survey. We will open the chat for participants once we finish with the prompted part of the discussion. If you have questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A. You can also upvote questions. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Heather Metcalf, the PI of the ARC Network and Managing Director of Research, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship for our home organization, WEPAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'd like to share a bit of background information about the ARC Network as we get started here today. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging workshops, a virtual visiting scholar, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. The ARC Network is funded through a cooperative agreement with the NSF Advanced Program with our home organization, the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. Now I'll pass it over to ARC Network's Project Director, Virginia Rhodes, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jess Gold. Dr. Gold is an associate research scientist at Northeastern University in the Sociology and Anthropology Department. She earned her BA in sociology from the College of William & Mary and her PhD in sociology at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Gold's research focuses on organizational analysis of gender and racial inequality, including university faculty hiring and scientific teams. Her research is characterized by a mixed methods approach, combining computational text and network analysis, quantitative statistical methods, and qualitative interviews and analysis. Thank you again for joining us, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Gold, and I will switch screen sharing over to you.
All right, let me get that started. All right, can you see the slides? Does that work?
You're good.
Okay, great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here, and thank you again to the ARC Network and board for hosting today. My name is Jess Gold. As Virginia said, I'm an associate research scientist at Northeastern University in the sociology department, and I'm honored to be one of this year's virtual visiting scholars for the ARC Network. My project is called Bringing the People Back In, a meta-analysis of equity workers in academic institutions, where my goal was to bridge the gap in knowledge between the why and the how of faculty equity work with a systematic analysis of who is doing that work. I propose to address the following research questions. What do we currently know about the landscape of who does faculty equity work in academic institutions? I came to this topic as an extension of other work I was doing at the time, including conducting interviews and working with career path data for change advocates involved in the NSF Advanced Program. Some of the questions driving those projects were, what are the career trajectories, advantages, or consequences for people in universities involved with equity work? If they were faculty, did being involved with such projects move them toward administrative positions? Did it affect research agendas or tenure and promotion? And did people stay at a single university or become more mobile? Or did they leave academia altogether? And among all of these questions, I was wondering if there were differences in these trajectories by the gender or race of the change agent. Yet, as I was working on this project, I found that there was little information at all about anyone who was behind the work of equity projects in universities. Nevertheless, nothing about the careers of those people. And so based on my own personal experiences in the field and doing research on this topic for several years, it seemed obvious to me that equity work is most likely taken on by those who are not in the majority or who are historically privileged groups. Yet as I began searching through the literature, I could not find much empirical work that clearly delineated whether or not this was true. My own previous research had investigated something similar. Who does engage scholarship? In that work, I focused on early career scholars and found that women, specifically Black, Latina, and Indigenous women, were by far the most likely to engage in a wide range of types of engaged scholarship. I grounded that central finding in other work on engaged scholarship, which finds that such work is often seen as care work, research, or only part of academic service work and not research scholarship. In these ways, such work is often devalued in traditional academic evaluation systems. And while I found that this kind of work was primarily done by scholars who have been historically excluded and marginalized in academia, there had been little work directly connecting the who of engaged scholarship to the what and why of how engaged scholarship is done and how it's valued. Bringing that research in line with my current work on change advocates in universities, I was wondering if there was empirical evidence, as I think many of those here today have very clear experiential evidence, that there's likely a pattern in the who of who is doing equity work that is tied to the why and the how. And this is what led for me to apply to the ARC Virtual Visiting Scholar cohort last year, as the fellowship aimed to support a year-long meta-analysis on the topic of equity in STEM. I wanted to be able to do an in-depth review of what we know about who does equity work in universities, as well as try and tease out differences across institutions, gender and race, and any information on where these people are in the academic hierarchy or structure. Equity is a huge topic in higher education, and so to provide the project more focus, I specifically aim to look at what we know about those who engage in work related to faculty equity. There's already a large body of interdisciplinary work mapping the multidimensional and intersectional inequities in the STEM professoriate. This includes a long list of catchphrases like leaky pipelines and chilly climates, as well as multi-method examinations of biased evaluation metrics, epistemic exclusion, and institutional barriers to the advancement of women and scholars of color in STEM fields across the academic career. Additionally, an emerging body of research examines the practices of moving towards equity, including case studies of successful or unsuccessful programs or projects, or calls to action for university faculty and administrators. And some of these involve an explicit or at least implied examination of the people behind those practices and projects. But as I said earlier, we do not have an empirical basis for knowing and understanding systematically who is involved in these projects. So we are well versed in the why of equity in STEM, why it's needed. We're becoming better versed in the how it's done through projects and programs. But today there's been no systematic analysis of the who is doing that work. And in this project, I aim to identify what is known about who does faculty equity work in academic institutions. In designing the project, I aim to investigate the type and location of institutions mentioned associated with these equity workers, what positions they occupy in the academic institutional space, such as being faculty themselves, university administrators, or staff in university offices focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And more generally, what publication venues are producing knowledge about these workers. My hope was to gather a broad corpus that was not only specifically on the topic of identifying people involved in faculty equity work, As I said, those are very rare, but more broadly, publications about faculty equity work in general, programs, initiatives, strategies, etc., through which I could use text searches and keyword and context analyses to try and triangulate information about the people involved in such work, even if they were only mentioned more indirectly. I undertook the project in 3 main phases. First was data collection. My goal was to be able to perform a metasynthesis and analysis of texts about faculty DEI workers in universities from 3 sources: peer-reviewed journals, higher education-focused news outlets, and general news outlets. As I had anticipated, this was an iterative data collection process where I started with broad search queries, skimmed articles for inclusion, tweaked search parameters to find more articles, skimmed those articles for inclusion, and continued modifying search terms and so on. One of the main challenges in this project is that I'm not only searching for knowledge where the entire article is about equity workers, but that the articles could be about specific equity programs, practices, or pitfalls, and be just likely to mention the people involved therein. Through these iterative searches, I ended up with a corpus of documents for screening that had 558 articles from across all 3 types of sources. The second stage was data preparation, which involved pre-screening the gathered text from searches by reading abstracts and skimming articles, downloading all texts into PDF files, converting those to plain text files, doing preliminary text cleaning using R, and identifying duplicate articles that appeared in the corpus from across the multiple searches, and then doing additional searches for articles where the text did not download correctly from the PDF. The pre-screening and skimming of articles is when I noted that, as the need for this project suggests, there were actually not very many of the relevant articles that actually mentioned anyone doing equity or diversity work and projects on campuses, either by names, groups, or offices. Many of the articles were what I coded as people adjacent, and I included those in a subcorpus for a more qualitative review for context that I include in some of the reflections at the conclusion of the study. Through this process, the final corpus ended up containing 383 articles with full texts ready and clean. And in the final stage, I used a mixed methods computational text analysis of the full texts using a keyword and context analysis to identify people and institutions, as well as a descriptive analysis to identify trends in the publication's metadata, such as when this knowledge has been produced and in what types of venues. Beginning with the publication metadata, I found that there were 114 unique publication venues, with most only having 1 publication present in the corpus. Publication venues with more than 1 publication in the corpus were mostly classified as higher education journals, including the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, Innovative Higher Education, and the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. Or they were in DEI and education specific journals, such as Gender and Education and Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, and International Journal. Among the national news outlets, the Wall Street Journal had the most articles in the corpus, followed by the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post. Regarding the publication venue field, the majority of publications in the corpus were published in education journals, and as I said, many of those in higher education specific journals, followed by medicine and health journals, and journals focusing on gender issues. The publications in medicine and health journals were often in highly specific area journals, often describing a single intervention or departmental program. On the contrary, many of the publications in education journals were about institutional level programs or initiatives. While there were publications in the corpus in each year between 2000 and 2024, which was how I defined the search parameters, there was a definitive uptick in publications in the early 2010s and a much more significant uptick starting every year in 2019. The uptick in the mid-2010s was much more significant uptick, and the much more significant uptick post-2019 are likely associated with a much broader public and institutional attention to DEI in universities due to the current political climate in the US, including increased activism and increased backlash around equity issues. Not only has public interest in research on DEI in universities increased, but the specific nature of this corpus suggests that identifying actors and entities on campus engaged in such work has also been increasing over time. Over time, these trends in publication venues did not vary much, but in recent years, 2019 and onward, there has been a noticeable increase in the number of publications published in social science journals, mostly sociology and communications journals, and science journals, including general scientific journals and area-specific journals focused in fields like biology and engineering. To begin the analysis of the text identifying people involved in faculty equity work, I began with a keyword and context analysis, which uses a list of predefined keywords and phrases and extracts a 15-word window on each side of that word or phrase for coding. These keywords and phrases created over 1,000 text chunks to code, which I did by hand, trying to identify if any of the chunks meaningfully identified some aspect of individuals or groups involved in the programs and projects. This here is an example of some of that coding, and in this case, surrounding the word equity. And you can see that some of the text chunks had up to 6 codes for how individuals were identified. I coded as broadly as possible at first, trying to capture as much information as possible for each chunk. This included whether it mentioned any specific team, individual, or campus entity involved in faculty DEI work, such as the name of the team, individual, or entity, which over time could be aggregated into bigger code groups. After coding all of the text, I then revisited the more specific codes and looked for meaningful ways to aggregate them, such as all levels of senior administrators or staff roles. In all, 47% of documents were coded as having a specific reference to equity workers. This included specific names of people or teams, such as Dr. Smith or the advanced team, names of campus offices like Office of the Provost or Office of Faculty Affairs, or characteristics of individuals or teams, such as Black woman, white woman faculty, BIPOC faculty, or queer feminist, and sometimes references to DEI offices and officers on campuses. Here are those classifications of equity workers that emerged from the corpus, broken down by the percentage of documents that they were found in. The broad categories include different types of university administrators and staff, faculty, and intersections across race and gender. Mentioning administrators and administrative offices were fairly common, and about a quarter of documents specifically mentioned senior administrators like presidents, provosts, deans, and about a third of documents specifically mentioned administrative offices like Office of the President, Chancellor's Office, or Office of Faculty Affairs. I kept administrators as individuals and as offices separated here to show that in about a third of documents, if the people involved in the faculty equity work were mentioned, it was often as broad as an entire office instead of an individual. These categories, together with other administrators, were mentioned in nearly 2/3 of all documents that mentioned equity workers at all. Documents were also likely to mention DEI offices and officers, together mentioned in about half of all documents, although, as you can see, a much higher percentage of documents mentioned DEI offices than officers as individuals. And when mentioning individuals involved in faculty equity work on campus, about a third of documents mentioned faculty involvement. In some of these references, I was able to tease out categories that showed categorical and intersectional breakdowns on when individuals were identified, such as BIPOC faculty in 13.4% of the documents, or BIPOC woman in 8.3% of documents. Other references characterized equity workers as LGBTQ, disabled, community leaders, and/or feminists. And in creating these categories, I chose to generally stay close to the language that was used in the articles themselves, so as to best represent what the published knowledge on equity workers actually says about these individuals. And I also want to note here that many of these categories are not mutually exclusive. Across the field of publication venues, there were several notable trends for which kinds of publications were more likely to mention certain classifications of equity workers, as shown here in this table. Unsurprisingly, publication venues in fields directly related to some aspect of the workers mentioned those classifications specifically. For example, you can see here that of publications in the field of DEI outlets, 44.4% mentioned administrators doing DEI work, but 66.7% mentioned DEI officers or offices. Similarly, 62.5% of publication venues concerning gender issues mentioned women as equity workers, which was a much higher percentage than any other publication venue field. The publications from national news venues that mentioned equity workers mostly mentioned DEI offices and officers, which was in 70% of those publications, followed by administrators in 40% of publications. Interestingly, these venues had no coded mentions of BIPOC or faculty members as equity workers, and only 10% of the news publications referred to women engaging in equity work. This trend of a high percentage of publications in a field mentioning administrators and DEI officers and offices was true across most types of publications. This may indicate that published knowledge about equity workers in all fields primarily implicates administrators, administrative offices, and DEI offices and officers. So this project did not aim to survey faculty equity workers in higher education institutions, but instead provide an overall understanding of whether and how equity workers are mentioned in published knowledge about this kind of work. Many articles on the topic of faculty DEI issues either investigate the depth and breadth of faculty equity issues, are calls to action for someone to address inequities, or less often, detail equity programs or initiatives that are in practice or being proposed. Yet, the someone on the other end of those calls to action and initiatives is seldom mentioned in their work and can become invisible labor that institutions can overlook and undervalue. By understanding what the published knowledge about equity work says about the people and groups behind this work, we can begin to see the gaps in our knowledge and better understand how to support DEI work and DEI workers. As gendered and racialized institutions, DEI work in universities is inherently counter to institutional logics and systems of practice, and can be conceptually understood as a form of protest from inside institutions. As such, this kind of work is often difficult, undervalued, and increasingly politicized, and even made illegal in some states. It is also most often taken on by individuals with multiple marginalized identities, putting them in potentially more precarious career positions. Among faculty, the term cultural taxation was coined to refer to the invisible burden many women and faculty of color face when asked, implicitly or explicitly, to shoulder most of the diversity-related work in academic departments. Recent work using time diaries found that this kind of labor is done primarily by faculty at multiple axes of inequality, including faculty of color, queer faculty, and faculty from working class backgrounds. Additionally, for STEM faculty, engaging in equity work can be seen as too political and delegitimize such faculty as scientists among their peers, with potential career consequences. There is also evidence that non-tenure equity workers in DEI offices and elsewhere on university campuses are more likely to be female and non-white, and face much higher rates of burnout and job uncertainty than staff in other units on campus. In diversity offices, Sarah Ahmed showed that many of the staff working in such offices are women of color, and that these individuals both do diversity work and are seen themselves through their bodies as being diversity in universities. Her work also pointed to the invisible, devalued, and often precarious work of staff in such offices. Finally, some research suggests that women involved in gender equity projects at universities are more likely to become administrators, suggesting that DEI work can be a potential pathway to university leadership, which has traditionally been predominantly male. Yet, as other sociological work and technology field shows, pathways to leadership for women may sometimes only be a step stool to mid-level management positions, and even then, only for white women. Overall, these trends suggest that, despite efforts to recruit male advocates and allies, equity work is likely mostly done by those in universities who already face marginalization based on multiple intersectional identities, and that doing such work may compound career inequality for such workers at all positions in the university system. The findings from this project highlight that in the literature on faculty equity work, those carrying out such work are often unnamed. When such workers are mentioned in conjunction with people, initiatives, or programs, this analysis shows that those being named are primarily senior university administrators, DEI officers, or even more often, the broader offices where those individuals work. In the publications that were identified as specifically mentioning faculty equity workers in higher education institutions, nearly 2/3 mentioned specific administrators or administrative offices, and about half of the publications mentioned DEI officers or offices. In aggregate, these were the most mentioned classifications. Across publication venue fields, DEI officers and offices were frequently mentioned across all fields, DEI officers and offices were frequently mentioned in DEI, management, administrative, news, and psychology publication venues, while administrators and administrative offices were mentioned most frequently in gender, management, administrative, policy, psychology, and social science publication venues. Some of these differences are unsurprising, such as DEI publications mentioning DEI officers and offices, and policy publications mentioning administrators and administrative offices. Yet, it is notable that when national news outlets specifically address the WHO in equity work, they focus on institutionalized DEI offices and officers and administrators, and are much less likely to mention faculty, BIPOC individuals, or women equity workers. In fact, none of the news outlet publications quoted mentioned faculty or BIPOC equity workers, while the majority of other publication venues, such as DEI, education, gender, medicine and health, and science venues, specifically mentioned these groups at least once. While previous research suggests that women and BIPOC faculty are more likely than their male and white counterparts to participate in faculty equity work, the published knowledge that specifically identifies who is doing this work focuses mainly on institutional level offices and individuals. This lack of visibility has also been translated into the corpus of published knowledge about equity workers, and it may contribute to the persistent struggle and lack of support many equity advocates face, especially when they are not already high-level administrators. The precarity of engaging in equity work in racialized and gendered institutions can sometimes mean hypervisibility, which can do more harm than good. Yet, the persistent omission in published work of the WHO and faculty equity work may also continue the perception that this work is broadly done and that there is not an unequal load of cultural taxation on already marginalized groups and individuals in academic institutions. Largely, what this project identified were the gaps in published knowledge about who is doing this work in universities. The people involved in faculty equity projects, programs, and initiatives remain mostly invisible. In future research on this topic, even if not naming names of who is doing this work, researchers and journalists may want to at least acknowledge the kinds of teams and individuals taking on this work in order to highlight both the importance of this kind of work and the efforts and risks taken by those who do it. The next steps are to keep working on the analysis in several key ways. First, in my proposal, I had planned to look at institutions mentioned and geographic locations where equity workers were identified. I was coding for this during the quick hand coding, but was not finding many mentions of institutions or regions, and so focused on the other individual identifications presented today. I'm working on some other methods of text extraction to see if there is more there to identify geographic location in a systematic way. For the news sources, I focused on searching databases from major daily national news outlets for this project. And in the future, I'd like to extend that to major metro area newspapers to see if that yields more or different results in the news corpus, especially by geopolitical differences or areas with large universities. Additionally, I noticed when coding the news corpus in particular, that doing a sentiment analysis may be useful. I already have those articles coded for identifying language around equity workers, but the articles varied widely in whether they were somewhat neutral, supportive, or obviously critical of equity work. This is a trickier tool to use when coding entire articles, so we'll take a good amount of chunking the articles and hand checking and testing as I code those. Finally, I hope to publish these findings in a higher education outlet, likely one focused on DEI, as a meta-analysis of faculty equity workers. But I will also build on these findings in the other projects I mentioned at the beginning, interviewing change agents in universities and working with career path data. My hope is for this project to both stand alone and become the scaffolding for my own future work and for the work of others. Thank you again to the ARC Network for their support and to everyone in attendance today. I know I finished a little early, but I figured more time for questions and comments if those were there. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Jess. And as she mentioned, the Q&A and chat is open for anyone in the audience who has any questions. And I'm not seeing any right now, but I can go ahead and ask you my one question I've got. So you mentioned your next steps looking at, major news outlets and institutions. Do you have any idea of what you might find when you're looking at these?
That's hard to say. So in terms of the institutional level, so I'll answer that with also work on another project, which I didn't mention in this, which was other interviews that I'm doing for a different project with people in DEI offices and officers. And what I'm finding in that is that while many campuses in the US have this kind of work, the places where faculty equity in particular is a focus varies really widely. And so on some campuses, it is housed in a DEI office or through some sort of like higher level administrative office. But in other universities, it's really just seen in talking to some of these DEI officers, I find that people say things like, they really don't have a role in faculty hiring and equity issues because faculty hiring is sort of a black box and it's really up to the faculty. And so that's why I was surprised to find in the national news outlets so few mentions of faculty doing this work and so many mentions of administrators and DEI offices. Just because in this other qualitative project I'm doing, it's been a lot more uneven. And so in terms of what institutions are mentioned, it could be really broad. And that's why I was thinking that bringing in major metro area dailies or newspapers from towns with large universities might be a better way to leverage some of those geographic differences than just looking for ways that names or regions are mentioned.
Definitely. Let's see. I guess in your whole presentation and even answering this question, we've kind of touched on, this kind of being invisible work. People aren't being specifically named or anything. And I wonder if you have any advice or recommendation to folks who are doing this work who might feel that it is invisible, that they're not making any kind of change or difference.
Yeah, I mean, I'd still say, if you're doing this work, I think that you're making changes, even if they're small, even if they're on your own campus or your own department, and that the scale of that can really vary over time. But in terms of the invisibility, I mean, I think that's why I was interested in this project, was because I do feel like those of us who are in this space, I feel like we know who's doing this kind of work because we interact, we go to things like the art convening or other conferences that are on this kind of work. And I remember when I was in grad school, it wasn't on faculty equity, but it was more about equity in universities in general. And it was almost entirely female, people of color, queer people. So it just was really striking. And it was sort of the first space in the university where I'd gone to where I saw that as being the overwhelming majority, which is why, again, I say, I think we all who are in this space know that, but I think more broadly, and what I was surprised to find in this project was that in the news outlets and even in the journal outlets, that's not really apparent. And so if you aren't in this space, I'm not sure you would know that. And so I guess that's sort of, so I think for those of us who are publishing things on faculty equity work, if you're doing these projects and then maybe writing things up in the advanced journal that are white papers or that are in peer-reviewed journals, finding ways to acknowledge the people behind these projects, I think is really an important practice that I think even those of us in the space are often guilty of not necessarily bringing out. So.
I guess if there's no questions or anything, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share, just in general?
Um, I don't know. I think I covered it mostly in the presentation, but again, thank you to the ARC network and the space. This has been, a really supportive place to do this kind of work, and I'm always just sort of grateful, even in past years, for the virtual visiting scholar cohorts, because I think people are doing such interesting work, and that you guys actually provide the funding and the support for that, I think is so important.
Looks like we do have a couple questions for you. So, do you know if there's been any work done on the social identities of who is publishing equity work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I did think about looking at the authors of the publications that I have in this corpus as a way of getting to, yeah, like who is publishing that work. And I think that also intersects really well with Brooke, who is the other ARC virtual visiting scholar who had her presentation last week. And hers is more on timeline to publishing. But again, I think our work really overlaps in this sort of like who is doing this work. And the one issue I ran into in terms of at least looking at the authors in the corpus that I was working with is just identifying people from names is both difficult and can be problematic. A lot of people are using, like AI, what I think it's called like genderizer, which tells you like the gender of the person based on the name, which again can be useful, but can also be problematic. And I wasn't ready to really tackle that in this project.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I was thinking of is that I think a lot of the people who are publishing on equity work and projects and programs are the people who are doing that work. And I did come across quite a few pieces that were more like autoethnographic. And so we're sort of self-identifying, but again, that's captured in the coding that I did. And so, yeah, I think that would be a sort of interesting add-on, but I think I would need to think a lot more critically about identifying authors, tying them institutions, and then what we could really learn from that.
Also, so in this current socio-political moment, increased recognition or visibility for this kind of work has the potential to set critical change makers up for particular kinds of harm. So doxing, legal repercussions. Two questions kind of on the same topic. Are you worried about people doing this work becoming targets in this current environment? And then how might we approach these considerations from an equity perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a common concern in the field, and I think is really tricky, but important to think about. When I know in other publications that I've worked on, we don't make our data publicly available. Just don't make it easy to find. But B, you try really hard to, as with any sort of research in that realm, make it anonymous. And I guess what I took away from this project, especially in the peer-reviewed research, is that there are ways to identify and recognize the I guess the burdens and the risk of who is doing that work without personally identifying them. But I do see that can also make even sort of whole groups in universities turn. To be honest, I don't have a good answer, but I do think that there's still something problematic about the invisibility of this labor, and that will just, again, it's this tension of like, we know who's doing the work, but it's not talked about. And so that's where I think maybe identifying in certain ways and uplifting could be helpful, even without obviously like personally identifying.
Thank you. Um, Another question. So what are some next steps for your research? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but can you elaborate some more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I elaborated the specific steps for this project, which involve bringing in more news sources, because I think, especially this, what I was noticing in the coding, I think I said at one point that the major national news daily with the most coverage identifying in some way equity workers was the Wall Street Journal. And that was where I really started thinking about how it might be useful to bring in a sentiment analysis, because a lot of, especially from that publication, a lot of the coverage is critical to negative of equity work versus in other publications where it's neutral to supportive. And so that's where I think, again, bringing in more sources in that corpus, and as well as trying to do some more either sentiment or qualitative coding of how people are talked about, I think could give a bit more nuance to that sort of framework of not only what we know about who's doing this work, but how it's being presented to the broader public, which I think could give us some more leverage, not just as academics who are in the space or people who are already working on equity and maybe reading peer-reviewed articles about equity work, but the broader public and what their interaction is through the news about people who are doing this work. And then the other next step is, again, like I was saying, there's these other projects where I'm really hoping that this creates a framework for some of these other research questions, gathering other types of empirical data.
Well, if there are no other questions, I will turn it back over to Heather, who can close us out a little early, but all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you so much, Jess, for this wonderful presentation and for all of the hard work that you did on this project. I think it's such valuable work to share with this community and for the ARC network and for the advanced community to think about and reflect on as we give visibility and credit and recognition to people for the work that they do. I know one of the projects that I've been working on that was related to potentially creating an exhibit for the advanced community, a digital storytelling exhibit that's recognizing the people of advance. And we've had a lot of these kinds of conversations where often PIs or program directors, project directors become the face of an advanced project, but there are so many people who make the project success possible that don't get that kind of visibility and recognition. So thank you for that. And for your dedication to driving change. We really appreciate the ways in which you apply your scholarship toward change. And thank you for being part of our Virtual Visiting Scholar program. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining us for this Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar, our last one for the year. And Ashley put into the chat the link to Dr. Gold's full report, so feel free to take a peek at that. It's also really helpful anytime we have a webinar for our community to provide feedback. You can also share future topics that you'd like to see us cover, and we'll share the link to that in the chat as well. We also want to share a reminder that the call for proposals for the Advanced Equity and STEM community convening is still open until December 16th. So for just a little while longer. The link is in the chat if you'd like to check out the call for proposals and think about submitting a proposal to present a session at our convening, which is happening in San Juan, Puerto Rico, June 1st through 4th, 2025. All right, and with that, we hope that you have a great rest of your week, a restorative weekend, and that everyone's year end turns out well, and that we have some time for restoration for the year to come. Thank you all.